Hey, good morning, everybody. It's Thursday, April 2nd, and we're glad you're back with us today. We are super pumped because to celebrate National Poetry Month, Penny and I have invited one of our favorite poets that we've used in our classroom and in our workshops, Micah Bournes. So before I introduce Micah, good morning, Penny.
Good morning, but I'm just so excited that Mike is with us. I'm just dying. I am such a fan. Oh, my word.
So Micah is a Long Beach, California-based poet who has worked internationally, has not only come to my school and work with my kids at Magnolia High, but Micah, when you came out a couple weeks ago, you had just come from England and done some work there. And I should probably say calling you a poet is probably limiting of what you do, because I know you're a writer, you're a musician as well. So we're so happy that you're with us today. So everybody, Micah
glad
Bournes.
to be here. Glad to be here.
Good to see you. So how are you doing in this time of weirdness? Is it stifled your creativity? Has it blossomed your creativity?
For me, obviously the circumstances are awful, but I've really been enjoying my time. I'm not gonna lie. I'm surprising myself because I think of myself as a super extroverted person, and I thought it was gonna be really hard. But I really embraced it, and I try to do that with all of life. I know, it's all about perspective. So many things can be seen as limiting or setback, but depending on how you look at it, it doesn't have to be that way. And so, I've really embraced the time of reflection and dove into my creativity for sure. Yeah.
Have you been writing during this time, poetry?
I have, I think one thing that's, I'm not trying to control or police anyone else, but specifically in the poetry community, I go to a lot of local open mics and things like that. And I think like the idea has been, how can we just shift what we do normally and shift that to an online version of it? And so they're doing their open mics on the same day, Friday night, 6 p.m., whatever, but it's over Facebook Live or Instagram, and everyone's just logging in and then reading their poems. And I don't think that's bad. I'm not saying that shouldn't exist, but I've kind of thought about it as a unique opportunity. I feel like this is unprecedented in the sense of probably never again in our lives will we be asked to stay inside for 2 months straight. And so this is a time where instead of just figuring out, how do I shift my normal routine and do something similar via the internet, I'm like, how do I sit with myself? When's the next time I'm going to have this much time to be with my own thoughts? And I've really been embracing that. So I try to write in a disciplined way. I write every day anyway. However, now I'm writing significantly more than I would, as far as like, I might write for 15, 20 minutes every day. But now I'm like, okay, I got like an hour and a half, 2 hours if I want, and just that sitting with myself, not just when it comes to my creativity, but my whole person, my body. Like I have a chronic illness. And so I'm always like pushing myself to the limits of my physical capabilities. And I'm like, oh, this is how it feels when I actually get the amount of rest that I want. And then I feel like on the other end of this, it will change things. Like I don't have to say yes to as many things, type of thing. But anyway, one of my most influential mentors when I was in college was a professor named Dr. McDuffie. And he said, we write to have that existential encounter, even if the encounter of the other is ourselves. And I love that. And I really feel like this is a time for me personally where instead of just trying to connect online with the same amount of people, I'm just really writing and connecting with myself and reflecting. And yeah, I would encourage, like, it's not even just like, oh, let me try to crank out my next book or crank out my next project, but let me really sit with myself and get my thoughts out through creativity and other things, and see how that feels.
Wow.
We both have used your poetry with our kids. Before we went on, I think Penny, you captured it perfectly. What was poetry like when you were in high school? To study poetry.
It was miserable. And I just remember that every time we got a poem, and it was some, kind of obscure language, and we had to spend an hour looking at every single phrase and word and taking it apart and looking at how it went, and then never had the rhythm and the feel of spoken word that we see. You know, that's what I use in my classroom primarily because it's has so much energy.
Yeah. You know, I think, and it's not just Shakespeare. I'm not here to pick on Shakespeare, but he's a good example of someone who is like held as this like, oh, he is the poet of the English language, the greatest poet ever. And I mean, I think it's quite ridiculous because Shakespeare's stuff was pretty lowbrow, a lot of sex jokes, you know, a lot of like in his time, he wasn't speaking super fancy. It was things that a lot of people got. It was contemporary in that sense. It was pop culture, right? It was Hollywood, right? It was like the thing to do, like people liked it. It wasn't quite this like exclusive thing that we make it out to be. And so like the modern equivalent of that would be studying contemporary poets who are referencing pop culture stuff that people are familiar with. It seems so foreign to us because it's been centuries, but he wasn't talking in a way that was confusing to his contemporaries. You know, it's confusing to us because we don't speak English like that anymore. So why don't we study people who are doing what he did, but in our context? And I think it's really frustrating with poetry, the way it's introduced. I had a similar experience in middle school and high school because you get this idea that, you know, it has to be Shakespeare, or it has to be like, you know, Emily Dickinson, early America, or even, you know, later, you know, like Robert Frost, you know, the beat poets. It's never right now. And whatever it is, it's like, and even with the Harlem Renaissance, I love the Harlem Renaissance. I'm thankful for it. But like, again, they were writing in their time, reflecting their current world. And we look back on it and say that was amazing. But there's plenty of contemporary poets of all cultures, of wherever you teach, you know, whether it's multicultural, predominantly Latinx or Black or whatever, there are poets who reflect the culture of your students. And when kids see themselves in a work, when they see a world that they recognize, when they hear vocabulary and references the things that they're familiar with, their eyes light up and they suddenly become more interested in it. And why wouldn't you, when there are plenty of contemporary writers like we all are, who are making important work that are speaking to their world? And it doesn't have to be either or, you know, it can be both and, but too often it's only the old world stuff, the quote unquote classics. And I just think that's ridiculous.
That raises, you know, lots and lots of issues. I mean, the power of now, this is talking about our world now. Any teacher who is not harnessing that power is really, really missing something. And I also like the idea, you know, that the students should see themselves in the poets that they're studying. Right? It raises issues of privilege.
Absolutely.
Cultural dominance.
Absolutely. You know, and it was like, I thought I hated poetry.
Right.
Because I was only exposed to the classics, which is predominantly really old, dead white folk. But literally the first time I had an experience with poetry where I felt connected to it and I understood not just the vocabulary, but the stories, and I saw myself reflected in it, I loved it. It was one night. One friend invited me to an open mic, and it was in LA, and it was multicultural, which is what I was used to. Poets from all different cultures and age groups. There was a younger crowd, but not exclusively. But they were just writing poems in vocabulary I understood, in stories that I understood. And I was like, this is dope. I actually really like this. So yeah.
So that idea, you know, we're gonna put a link on this when we're finished to your website, and that your poem, probably your best known for, is Native Tongue, and that's really kind of, although there's a lot of great poems on your website, that poem really gets at this idea, right? That Shakespeare, you know, invented his own words and did his own stuff, but now when kids today do it, it's considered not educational or not challenging. Right. And you always make sort of the connection that kids should be studying hip hop and other forms of poetry.
Absolutely. Hip hop, I don't care what color you are. I don't care if you're from the country, from the city. I don't care if you're in Asia. Hip hop is a global force. And kids, teens all over the world love hip hop, listen to hip hop. And it's something they care about, are familiar with. And if you actually dive into rap lyrics, there's so much there. You know, the stereotypes are stereotypes, and that's it. Of course, there's certain songs that are talking about awful things or unimportant things, but that's in any genre. You can listen to rock music that's talking about violence and booty shaking, you know what I'm saying? But there's so much, like don't play with me. Country music is the same, you know what I'm saying? But if you actually dive into hip hop, and there's so much content there that can be useful in getting kids interested. One of the last workshops I did, I was dissecting a song by Lil Wayne. And again, Lil Wayne particularly is an artist who's seen as someone who, you know, sips a lot of purple and does a lot of drugs and has nothing to say. And he has this song called Bloody Mary, and he's describing his neighborhood, and it's amazing. It's I mean, the poetry in it, the metaphors in it. Like he has this one line. He says, oh, I'll just read the whole part. He says, "It's do or die. I come from where we used to crime the Uzi 9, more important than school supplies. The pools is dry, my brothers, and the food is fried. The news is lies. The pigeons is too spooked to fly." Right? So first we go and we break down the rhyme scheme. Okay, he has an internal rhyme and an end rhyme on every single line of the whole verse, which is very difficult to do. Do or die. I come from where we used to crime the Uzi 9. But then we would break down each lyric. He says, hey, look, I come from, so he's describing his neighborhood. He says, where the Uzi 9 is more important than school supplies. In my neighborhood, weapons are more important than schools having the supplies they need to offer a good education, right? And then he says, the pigeons are too spooked to fly. And so we get in this conversation like, what do you think he means by that? He comes from a neighborhood that's so dangerous that pigeon, what is a pigeon? It's a bird. Birds are meant to fly. They're created with wings. But even if you have the potential to fly, when you're born in certain neighborhoods, because of all the danger around, you're too afraid to reach your full potential. So here we are having this conversation. And then he's talking about, food deserts. He says the pools is dry, my brothers, and the food is fried. Right? So we have these conversations about justice and food deserts, and you have, certain low-income neighborhoods that only have fast food, only have fried food, and you got to drive miles and miles until you get to a grocery store. And we're dissecting Lil Wayne here. You know what I'm saying? It's like there's so much here. But, high school teachers ain't teaching Lil Wayne. They teaching Shakespeare. But I guarantee you, if you walk into class and say, we're teaching Lil Wayne, your kids are going to be way more interested. And the content is there,
God, I love that. I teach at a college, a university, freshman composition. We get to choose the focus of our courses, and I just put down right into my department chair, hip hop composition.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Yeah,
right? For sure.
And again, so it's one thing to dissect, but then when we start writing with the students, it's so amazing to me because if you sit down, no matter how much you care about a child, and if they believe you care about them, even if you say, hey, are you okay? Is everything going fine at home, whatever? Yeah, it's all good. It's fine. It's like pulling teeth to get them to say anything. But as soon as you say, well, you introduce them to spoken word or hip hop or whatever, and you kind of show them how to do it. And then, hey, let's write your own spoken word poem or write your own rap verse. And suddenly it's like, Catholic going to confession, you know what I'm saying? It's just like, they're just saying stuff that you're like, what in the world?
Well, I think that's a mistake that a lot of teachers make, is that their poetry unit is just simply zoom in and overanalyze the heck out of whoever's poems, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, Penny and I have found that spoken word poems, not even in a poetry unit, but if we're studying inequity, or if we're studying, any particular unit, but sprinkling in spoken word poems and having kids watch, native tongue, and then have that, not giving them 5 questions to answer, but saying, what do you think after you hear this poem, and letting kids generate their own thinking. We have found that there's probably nothing in our entire year, right, Penny, that spurs writing, self-generated writing, more than sitting next to spoken poets.
Right. Yeah, that's why we do it day after day after day in our classes. And it's very hard to convince teachers that this is as important as it is. But what you described, you said, when we start writing with students, I'm like, do you know how many English teachers don't write with them and try to write next to a spoken word poem and show them how many struggles we have ourselves to do that work, and then that invites them in to do the work.
Absolutely. And I understand, like, I've done a lot of teaching and workshops, but I understand I'm not a teacher, right? I don't sit with the same students day in and day out. And so a lot of teachers I've talked to, they want to have that degree of distance, professionalism. And I get that, but I feel like, if you are willing to be vulnerable and lead by example, no matter how good and whatever teacher, like, people want to see you as a person, as a human. Students will open up, and it will not just improve their education, but their whole holistic health. You know what I'm saying? Because I go in, I'm like, I'm an artist, I'm a poet. I go into these places thinking I'm going to do a poetry workshop, but it's like, they're bringing up all kind of stuff that is important beyond just learning how to write a poem. And I'm thankful for that, for those conversations, and it starts stuff, makes their teachers and community aware about some things going on. But I think that if you're afraid of vulnerability, or you feel, I don't want them to know, then there are going to be limits on how deep you can go. But there's this documentary I know it's on the American Netflix. I think my friend in the UK couldn't access it, but it's called Mortified Nation. And I would strongly suggest every single teacher watch it. I don't know about showing it to your students, but maybe, depending on the school and whatever. The funny thing is, though, so what Mortified Nation is, it's a series of events, and they're still going on. But it started out as this group of friends who, they're adults, late 20s, early 30s, and they were all writers, and they realized they had been writing since they were kids. And so they decided to do an event. It was supposed to be just a one-night event where they were reading their journal entries and their poems from middle school and high school, right? And it was hilarious because you have these like 35-year-olds reading their 14-year-old thoughts, their 17-year-old thoughts, right? And some of it is funny, but some of it is devastating. Some of it is R-rated. Some of it is, you're listening and you're like, what the heck? Like, but then you think about it and you're like, no, that's what we were going through at 12. That's what we were going through at 15. Those are the things we were thinking about. And it seems extreme, but it's really not, because they were actually written by teenagers, right? And there's a teacher that they interview in this documentary, and he goes, so there's a documentary about these events, but they still happen like every few months in cities around America. And he goes, I come to Mortified as a way to be reminded of where my students are at in life. And I'm hearing these stories of teenagers, even though they're 40 years old now, but they wrote it when they were teens. He's like, and I'm thinking, oh, this is what my students are going through. And it's a crazy reminder as they're, struggling with an abusive parent, figuring out their sexuality, healing from trauma, whatever, discovering their creativity. And it's just amazing. But again, it's through creative means. Some of it is poetry, some of it is journal entries, some of it is storytelling. This one kid, he didn't play an instrument, but he made a rock band in his head, and he wrote like over 200 songs, but he never learned how to play guitar. So he's just like reading the lyrics of these songs, and they're like, oh my gosh, this is a 12-year-old boy talking about some crazy stuff. But anyway, I think it's just, in relation to this conversation, it's a really helpful documentary. It's definitely worth a watch.
Wow. I will.
So,
absolutely.
Yeah, Mortified Nation is what it's called. Yeah.
Sounds like a way for teachers to really I think we forget what it's like to be 17, 15, 14. So it's a way of building that sort of empathy. I know that when you've come to my school last 2-3 years in a row, the kids really like your thinking about the importance of volume, getting over this fear that what you're going to create is crappy. The fact that that's a necessary step in creating stuff that's good. Could you maybe speak to that a little bit, Micah?
Yeah. I think that's one of the biggest hurdles to creativity. So many people, no matter what type of creativity, they're interested in it, they want to do it, but they're afraid that it's going to be bad. And their thinking is, unless I'm really good at it, there's no point in doing it, which I think is flawed. I always ask people, what is your motivation? Why do you want to create? Creativity is something that is healthy for us. It really doesn't matter if it's good or not. If it is good, that's awesome. But I didn't start writing poetry or music because I thought I was really good at it. I wasn't really good at it. I had never done it before. But once I started, why did I start? Well, the night I went to that open mic, I saw the vulnerability. I heard my story. I was so excited to realize that other people understood what I was going through, and that there was a place where I could share that without being embarrassed or ashamed or whatever. And so when you think about your motivation for writing, if you need to process those things, right? If you need to get them off your chest, if you need to connect, if you need to whatever, then whether or not the poem is good is irrelevant. You did something that was healthy for your overall, self and your spirit and your mind. And so I say, first of all, your motivation. And the metaphor I use is exercise, right? Like, even if you're not a professional athlete, it's still good to exercise. If you like going for a jog, but you're not very quick, it wouldn't make any sense for your friends to be like, why do you bother running? You're not going to go to the Olympics. You're not going to win a gold medal. Just stop. And you're like, excuse me. Like, I know I'm not fast. I'm not up here trying to win a gold medal. I'm exercising because it's healthy for me. And that's why I say, why don't we treat creativity like that? Who cares if you're not good at it, quote unquote? It's healthy for you. Do it. If you enjoy it, just do it. It will definitely be good for you. So there's that. But then the idea of being afraid of making poor art, just embrace the fact that you will. That's a part of the process. The way I describe it is, it's not that it's quantity over quality, but it's quality comes by quantity. Of course, I understand the desire to make good art, but every single artist I know, no matter what type of art, painter, poet, anything, the majority of what you make is not going to be good. It's really absurd to think every single time I pick up my pen, brilliance. Every time. You know what I'm saying? Like, every time I pick up that paintbrush, it's going to be a masterpiece. But that's the type of pressure we put on ourselves, And I say, we don't even put that on other artists that we like. I love music, but if I get an album with 12 to 15 songs on it, no matter who they are, no matter how good they are, I'm probably going to like at most about half of the songs. Sometimes I'll only like 3 or 4 songs on an album and still be like, yeah, that was good. I like those 4 songs. I'm not like, oh, wow, Kendrick Lamar had 12 songs and I only liked 4 or 5. He sucks. No, I'm like, it's just not for me, And so, but with us, we think anything we do, no skip over tracks. Every album is my greatest hits album. Every poem is the best thing in the world. So you referenced one of the metaphors that I use from this book I read, probably the most influential book on my creative process. Is called Art and Fear by Ted Orland and David Bales.
It's one of my favorites.
Yeah,
we both read it.
Yeah. I love that book. And the premise of the whole book, and he just keeps, they keep illustrating it over and over again with so many different ideas, but it's just that, hey, the majority of what you create is not going to be good. It says the purpose of the vast majority of your work is simply to teach you how to make the small portion of it that will be excellent. And the story that stood out to me the most was of a ceramics teacher. And they say, the ceramics teacher in the beginning of the class, in the beginning of the semester, divided the class down the middle. And they said, half of you will be graded on quality and the other half on quantity. And so the quality side only had to make 1 pot the whole semester to get an A, whereas the quantity side, but that 1 pot had to be nearly perfect if you wanted to get an A. Whereas the quantity side, it didn't matter how good or bad the pots were. You just had to make 50 pounds for an A, 40 pounds for a B, and so on. And so as the story goes, fast forward to the end of the semester, all the best pots came from the quantity side, not the quality, because they had no pressure. they said, hey, it's just about making a lot. So they made pot after pot after pot, and they weren't very good at first. But in the process of making 50 pounds worth of pots, they got better and better and better and better. And even though they weren't even worried about if it was good or bad, they ended up making much better pots, where it says the quality side sat around theorizing about perfection and had nothing more to show for themselves than grandiose ideas and a pile of dead clay. And I'm like, the first time I read that, I was like, that was me. It was like, I would write like one line, 2 lines, be like, oh, no, it sucks. It doesn't even exist yet. What do you mean it sucks? Like, finish the thought, you know? But I was paralyzed by this desire to make the perfect pot, you know? And I'm just at a point in my life where I'm like, literally, even though I feel like I am a far better writer than I was 10 years ago when I started, my percentage is about the same. And when I say my percentage, I mean, if I'm writing poems, songs, whatever, 8 out of every 10 things I write are mediocre to bad. So when that would discourage me and I would only write 10 things, then I'd have 2 good ones. But now I don't care. So I'll write 100 poems and I have 80 bad ones, but I have 20 good ones instead of 2. You know what I mean? And so it's like,
Wow.
I think if you just discipline yourself, I think we sit around waiting for inspiration to strike. And the way I describe it is, I get that inspiration every now and then, but I don't wait for it. Because if I discipline myself to create, even when I don't feel inspired, when the inspiration comes, I will capitalize off of it more because I've stayed in practice, as opposed to, you know, okay, it's been 3 months, I haven't felt inspired, so I didn't write anything. Now I have a great idea and I feel inspired, but I'm rusty because I haven't written in 3 months, as opposed to I've been writing every day for 3 months, bad ideas, crappy poems, but now I have a great idea and I'm still in practice. I don't have to get back in shape, you know?
What interesting implications for English teachers, right? The kid, if you want to kill a writer, make sure you grade everything that writer produces, right? And, you know, Penny and I talk about it in our book, 180 Days, the just incredible importance of lots of low pressure, ungraded writing, right?
Absolutely.
And giving them space in class to do that, because teachers typically will say, well, they can do that at home. And I'm like, yeah, but how many of us go home and our demons get on our shoulders and we're like, absolutely. I can't write. This is not. But in a room of writers, you tend to just start writing.
Absolutely. And that's like when I do workshops, like when I do like 2-hour workshops, you know, I do a good amount of setup, but then I'm like, I don't want you to take this home. Even if it's multiple days, even if I'm going to see them the next day, I'm like, no, let's take the next 40 minutes and let's just all do this together, you know? And so it's like, wait, like we're just going to sit here and be quiet and write? Like, yeah, because you're going to be distracted at home, you know, because you can't ask a question at home, you know, with all these other people. So I definitely think that, like you said, Kelly, low pressure, like just let it come out. If it's good, it's good. If it's not, it was still worth creating, you know?
I
always called first draft writing, you know, and let me see your crappy first drafts.
Yes. And I think that's the thing. People expect the first draft to be the final draft. Yeah. It's like, it has to come out in its final form. And it doesn't make any sense to think that.
You know where that comes from, though? I think about when watching teachers start an assignment in writing with a rubric and the quality thing. It's got to look like this. Yeah. And so that you've got 3 weeks, but you got to create this thing. That's that exact quality quantity thing you're showing. If instead it was at the end of this unit, you got to give me 50 pages of narrative writing at the end of 9 weeks. And I don't care what the quality is, you'd get better writing. Kids would get better. Yeah.
Absolutely.
It's so fascinating, and such an about face from the way schools are set up and writers are put in situations where they feel like they fail. Because at the college level, I am hearing all of my students walking in saying, number one, they don't know what it means to read for writing craft. They really don't read that way. They don't know what they can learn just by reading. But then they say, I'm a horrible writer. I have no confidence in my writing. I've never been good at it. And I'm like, you're a creative mind, a creative spirit. What's in the way, right?
Absolutely. And I've learned, because again, I write poetry, but also music, and I'm just around a lot of type of creatives. And confidence has nothing to do with ability. It just doesn't. That has everything to do with your spiritual health, and your mental health. It has nothing to do with how good you actually are. I was listening to a podcast by it's called Broken Record by Rick Rubin, and he's interviewing Andre 3000 of Outkast. Now, Outkast was literally one of the most successful hip hop duos in the history of hip hop, right? When they stopped making music together, Big Boy, one of the members, went on to have a pretty thriving solo career, and he's put out several solo albums. Andre 3000, who is highly revered as one of the dopest lyricists in hip hop, has never done a solo album since Outkast stopped making music together. And so Rick Rubin is interviewing him, and he goes, "Hey, Andre, what are you working on? Can we be expecting an album?" And he says, "I'm just not confident enough. I'm just not confident." You are Andre 3000 of Outkast. You have won all kind of awards. People think you're one of the best MCs to ever rap, and you are not confident enough. And then he went on to talk about his struggles with mental health, his struggle with anxiety, his struggle with living up to his own reputation. He goes, "I think one of the worst things is the fact that I was so successful. It was so bad for my creativity because now I'm trying to live up to my own expectations or people's expectations of me. Oh, I'm so great. Well, can I make anything that's better than what I've made in the past?" And so here, and I'm like, this man does not lack ability. He lacks confidence, and it has nothing to do with his ability. It doesn't matter how good he is. He has other things he needs to work through, his mental health, his spiritual health, and he's very open about it. He says he's been diagnosed with like social anxiety and some other things. But it's the pressure. The metaphor he gave in the interview, he was talking about, he's like, when you're a kid playing in your room, the door's closed, and your imagination is running wild. You got the unicorns and the dragons and the leprechauns and all these things, and you're creating this world. He goes, and then your mom walks in the room and says, Andre, it's time for dinner. He goes, as soon as she walks in that room, opens that door, calls your name, your whole world disappears. Everything's gone because you have that set of eyes on you. And he goes, that's how I feel. Because I feel like when I was younger, before I was successful, as I was creating, I just had the whole imagination. And he goes, but now that I've had success, I feel like my mom's in the room, but the whole world's in the room looking at me. What are you doing? What are you creating? And he goes, that pressure, that expectation, those eyes, it makes it hard for me to get back to that place where I can just let my imagination run wild, So he's talking about, how do I figure out how to get back to that low pressure thing where I'm not embarrassed of my ideas. I'm not embarrassed to experiment. And so anyway, but again, I'm listening to this whole thing and I'm like, Andre 3000 says he's not confident enough. What in
right.
the world?
And this is the same issue that we deal with in class. Kids come in, my writing sucks. I don't want you to see it. I don't want you to grade it. I know. And, we talked with John Warner the other day, another writer, talked about, creating the conditions that make you want to create. And so I think really one of the values of this conversation we've had today, Micah, is this idea of creating conditions that allow creativity, to allow students' stories to emerge. But I got to say, before we leave, could we coax maybe you read a poem of yours for us?
Yeah, maybe. I like that though. And it's back to something you were saying earlier about creating alongside your students, right? So with this last image that Andre gave, like, are you going to be that parental figure that walks in and shuts down the creativity? Or are you going to be that person who gets down on the carpet and says, yo, let's imagine this together. Oh, what are you doing? Let's keep going, instead of making the world disappear, So, but I'll read this poem. It's called 2020.
Is it in your book?
So I am working. So I have an anthology that I helped put together, Fight Evil with Poetry. And it is 30 different poets writing about justice issues. So I have 3 poems in here, but I'm actually working on my first full-length book of poetry. I've done some albums of hip hop and spoken word, but yeah, this poem 2020 will be in my book, and it will come out later this year, within the next couple months. And it's called Here Comes This Dreamer. So, but real quick, by way of introduction, this poem was sparked by several different things, a conversation I had with a friend, but the movie Back to the Future. I was online looking and I saw an article about it, and the future that they go to was 5 years ago. It was 2015. Yeah. I was like, oh my gosh. I was like, that's hilarious. So that's what sparked this poem. It's called 2020. 5 years beyond Back to the Future's future. 8 years beyond the Mayan apocalypse. 2 decades beyond Y2K. We exist in a future we worried would never be. I exist in a history I worry will never die. My white friend cries, ashamed of her naivety, not realizing her father was more than a socially acceptable amount of racist. Said he was disgusted at the thought of her holding her new Kenyan boyfriend's hand. I thought of the hugs we've shared, of how repulsed he would be by our gentleness. I thought of King's dream, still a dream. I thought of Langston's dream, still deferred. I wondered how short the fuse must be by now. I thought of Frederick Douglass, of his courage, of his marriage to a white woman in the 1800s, shortly after his Black and first wife stopped dreaming forever. I thought of dreams. I thought of future, of how it will disappoint me, of how it is 2020 and we still don't have flying cars or hoverboards. I thought of time, of how it will not save my children. I thought of love, of how it always takes courage, no matter what century it is beaten and burning and dreaming in.
Ooh.
Wow.
I tell you right now, if I were in the classroom tomorrow, my kids would be writing right next to that one. What a beautiful poem. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Thanks for having me, y'all.
So
can I say the most exciting thing for Kelly and I is that we're presenting together at NCTE, providing it happens, and we want you to read your poem, perform your poems. And that's just such a gift you have for not only reading them, but creating them.
So Penny and I and Micah and poet Georgia Hurd will be in Denver in November if everything has calmed down and it's safe by that time, and we're hoping that that is the case. And I cannot wait, Micah, to see you again in person and to have you share some of this thinking with the audience at our national conference. I'll finish with this. When you came to my school, I had a student, Athena, who was so inspired by you that and this is a very, very quiet kid, she actually got up and did a spoken poem with passion in the class. And I was like, where did this kid come from? And eventually later in that year, I think that experience and her interaction with you gave her the courage to apply, and she became our graduation speaker, this quiet kid who hadn't said a whole lot in class. So you taught me firsthand the power of spoken word poetry and how it affects the lives of my kids. And so I want to thank you so much for that and for joining us today.
Oh, thank you so much. It's good to meet you, Penny. Thanks for good to see you again, Kelly.
Thanks again. Thanks everybody for joining us today. We'll see you tomorrow.